All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoeette. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about preparedness, exercises, and adventure. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back, and thank you for joining us here at the podcast. We appreciate you being here. Listen, preparedness, exercise, and adventure. The idea about today's episode, it's all behind the concept of every once in a while, people talk a lot about practicing, right? How do we practice preparedness? How do we practice being ready? How do we know this plan will work? We've written a great plan. Everybody understands it, but how do we know when the shizzy hits the fizzy that things will work the way we think they will? The answer to that question is you don't. But exercising and practice is possible within the context of emergency preparedness without having to simulate the end of the world. It's that old question that we ask all the time. Do you need to go without food for a few days to understand what hunger feels like? Does that make you better prepared to be hungry? Not drink for a day because you want to feel extreme thirst. So you know what extreme thirst is like. Is that really helpful? Or you don't want to change your clothes for a week to see whether merino wool really does make you eventually stink at some point. What is that? Is it the seventh day where I have to change my shirt with merino wool? And I want to find this out because you know what the ads tell me? Probably not. So do you need to turn the power off in your home to practice a power outage drill? Do you need to evacuate the home on short notice to see whether or not it'll work? Let's scare the living bejesus out of the children and everybody in our neighborhood as we know something obviously they don't, as we're frantically putting things in the car, yelling and screaming commands. Everybody's running around. You're jumping in the car and you take off down the road and all your neighbors are looking at WTF. What do they know that we don't know? And then when you come back and tell them it's all a drill, all of a sudden, you're not invited over for the potluck, right? Because you might see a little nuts. Well, welcome to the concept of tabletop exercises. Now, TTX, as they're called, are a cornerstone of efficient planning in the military and emergency services. And they've recently been adopted in the business continuity environment, which for those of you who are not familiar, that's the formal study of business preparedness within a corporate and business environment. And so TTXs are staples of emergency management planning, right? Now, a table, the best description is they excel when key individuals walk through a scenario discussing what they would do, who would they employ, and the timelines involved. And periodically there may be injects into the TTX to complicate the situation. However, really the value is having key folks in the same location, building that social capital, building the relationships, and understanding the priority of other important public agencies and corporate divisions, depending on what side you're on, in the middle of this. And TTXs are great because what it means, it's a low resource, low demand, high value activity, right? There's not a lot of those out in there in the world. Most times you have to, I have to take time off work to practice camping because I need to be away, et cetera, whatever it may be. But a TTX is really just getting around the kitchen table for all of the kids that are old enough to finish a sentence. It means they're old enough to participate, to talk about what your world would look like when this happens. It's about exercising the plan without doing any physical activity, right? You could sit down and talk about when the power goes out, this is how we're going to handle the world. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to act. This is how we're going to communicate with each other. Whatever your scenario might be, you look at it that way. The same thing with evacuation, right? It works really, really well. Now, on the professional side, there's one city that does this really, really well. And I'm not going to tell the city because it's a confidentiality agreement, but this one city in the province of Ontario every week brings together the on-duty shift sergeant from the police, the duty fire chief, and the supervisor from the EMS. and they're all coached in person in the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, by their subject training advisor. Which means the training advisor for the fire department is there, the training advisor for the police department, and the training advisor for the paramedics are there. And they're accompanied by a representative of the Public Works Department to represent the city workers themselves, and that this is managed within a framework by the emergency management staff. So they're given a scenario and they walk through questions, decisions, communication, command and control, and they debrief after. So basically what it is they pull a towel off a map of a part of the city, and then they're told a scenario that happens. And one of the three services will be initially called to the scene to deal with it. And then they're given injects. This is what you find at the scene. What do you do next? And they walk them through all of the steps, and they get to talk about, and when they have questions, the supervisor for EMS might say, okay, I'm going to marshal, this looks like it's going to be a significant event. I think I'm going to need additional ambulances on standby, so I'm going to marshal my ambulances here at this point. And they're going to be under the control of the supervisor paramedic car that will be deployed and positioned here. And it's really interesting because what they actually have is they have Hot Wheels cars, those little dinkies, what we used to call them as kids, with the call signs of all of the prominent vehicles in the emergency services taped to the top. So they'll say, okay, here's the paramedic supervisor car, and it lands. I need 4 more ambulances. And so the training supervisor will say, fine, your ambulances will arrive in 5-minute intervals. So as they're going at 5-minute intervals, the training supervisor just hands another ambulance and say, position this where you will. They've now arrived on scene. And you can see it going through, and then there's different interjects. You find this. This is a new piece of information that comes out. And basically, they practice working together. The scenario is only the vehicle. It's about the people at the organizational level. And this is the value of the TTX in emergency services, right? They get to walk through how they think they would respond to an emergency, how they would likely employ the assets that were available to them, whether they would bump it up a level to a different type of emergency, whether they activate a healthcare emergency in one of the hospitals for a mass casualty situation. Do they go to, agreements with shouldering and other municipalities to get resources? How would they employ public works vehicles? What communications tools they would use? Would they deem it necessary to issue a emergency message to the population of the city? These are all the things, and they do this every single week, pretty much about 40 to 45 weeks a year. There are other events that interpose, but basically, and it's a different shift supervisor, it's a different scenario, and they keep putting them through this because what they understand is when an emergency happens and these people show up at the scene, not a lot of time, not every day does every sergeant or every firefighter get to work with each other, a police sergeant and a fire chief. But this way, the likelihood that these two individuals sat through a TTX together is greatly increased, so that when Bob shows up, Muhammad, the police sergeant, looks at him and goes, yeah, it's Bob. Hey, how you doing, buddy? Listen, this is what we're looking at. That's a whole different level of relationship and trust that's built across emergency services. Traditionally, emergency services are very much siloed activities, right? They're organizations that work independently and sometimes have to work beside each other, but they're not necessarily inherently cooperative, right? This happens in emergency services. So one of the ways to break through this is they have this TTX, but it also talks about how they would integrate with the EOC, when to activate the EOC, when to bump this up, when do we have to notify the elected political decision makers, how do we do that, who takes control as the incident commander, where are we going to establish a command post. So all of these things are greatly improved because all of these organizations practice together. So if you're in emergency management or you work with emergency management and this is not occurring in your city, and remember, this is a zero cost activity. These people are on duty. They're actually working. They just take an hour out of their shift once a week to do this exercise. And then I was there for an observer for one of these exercises, and really it was a great exercise, but I think the huge value is afterwards. The fire department, the EMS debating back and forth as to how they would do something. And they got not in a heated debate, but they got in a pretty detailed event and they were putting their positions back and forth. These are the type of argumentative, positive decisions that would have never occurred had emergency management not set up this kind of exercise. So as I said before, you could same for your family. A family TTX, as I said, is a brilliant strategy for opening the floor for kids, elderly, and all family members to ask questions and to discuss how you'll manage disruption, the shelter in place, the evacuation, your trifecta of preparedness plans that we talk about here at Inside My Canoe Head and our parent company, Preparedness Labs Incorporated. Now, as you discuss the scenario with your family, the plan and what the expectations are, the imprint on the mind happens. Anxiety lowers and stress levels fall away. People become more comfortable with the idea that this event may occur, and when it does happen, it scares less. It seems more manageable, and thus fear, the most powerful weapon, is held at bay or at least farther away. When children get an opportunity to practice and think their way and have a plan and a strategy for when challenging events happen, kids will be very, very confident in the fact that they'll just do what the parents told them to. Oh, mommy and daddy, or mommy and mummy, or daddy and daddy told me that this is what I'm supposed to do when this happens. They told me they're going to come get me. They told me that I have to go and get these things done. This is what they're going to do. And mom and dad have said, we're going to be okay if we do these things. You imprint a plan. So it's less of, oh my Lord, I don't know what's going on. The Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Everything's coming about, people screaming and yelling. It's the fact that everybody knows what their jobs to do. Now, the jobs that you'll assign will obviously be different based upon their maturity and their ability to understand the complexity of the situation. That's a personal call yourself. But I've always said that where you excel in preparedness when you have a strong family preparedness plan is while everybody else is trying to figure out what's going on and pounding away on their texting device or trying to figure out information, your plan, your family is calmly and confidently executing a well-understood and well-rehearsed plan. You've sat around a table, you've talked about it. The kids know what they're going to do. You don't have to worry about, is parent one getting child one or is parent two getting child one? Because that's already been determined. So if communication lines are down, parents are confident that the other parent is executing the plan that's been assigned to them. So if parent one gets child one and parent two gets child two, if they're in different schools, then they just do that. If they can't talk to each other, they just know how that plan is executed. That's how a TTX. And if the children are involved in your TTX at your family, then the children know parent one or parent two is going to come get me, right? And I will be taken care of, and they're going to come take me. And when they pick me up, we're going to head directly home because that's where we'll meet the rest of the family, And then when I get home, these are the things that I need to do, right? When kids have something to do in stressful, dangerous situations, they feel more confident and less anxious. Not zero, not at all zero, maybe not even close to zero, but far more confident, right? And that's the point we're trying to do with preparedness. This is why I keep saying, and you hear repeatedly on this podcast and in many of my writings, that preparedness is a lifestyle, not a stockpile. And that means the lifestyle involves activities. You understand what you're supposed to do, and you have exercises. So think about it. You make the trifecta of preparedness plans that we talk about, right? And when you have that's your power, that's your most likely and least dangerous power loss, and your most dangerous, least likely evacuation, and your sudden income loss plan. So you have those three plans, your trifecta, and you make them and you talk them out through TTX. So basically, we understand that the events that could happen to you and your family from an emergency or disaster perspective are on a spectrum. On one end, you have your power loss. On the other end, you have evacuation. And if you're ready to go for either one of those, then the likelihood is by default, you will be ready to manage anything that happens in between. And because of that, and you have the plan, then you are improving the likelihood that you will be able to carry on life and have less disruption to no disruption and less stress or loss to your family. It doesn't erase anything. It just puts you in a better stead. It puts you in command and control of the situation and not the situation being in command and control of you. And that is very, very important. So that's the value of preparedness exercises. Now, adventuring. I'm an outdoor adventurer. I love outdoor adventuring. And I've often belittled the bug out bag concept on this podcast in many different times. The idea that somehow bushcraft is the key skill in a modern and technologically enabled society, that we'll all run out into the wilderness, build cabins, and trade goods. Really? No, that's not going to happen. But camping is fun, right? And the idea is that bushcraft is a great skill to learn if you're somebody who spends a lot of time in the outdoors. The likelihood that if you live in a suburban or urban environment and you're rocking an incredible life and you want to insulate your family against disruptions, everything short of a societal collapse is not going to involve you working with bushcraft, right? It's just not, right? You're not going to be out into the woods and having to learn to survive. Now, if you do a lot of outdoor travel and wilderness travel, that's a different scenario, right? So a great TTX for people who are adventurous, for people who are into bushcraft because they do spend time in the woods, is something called the Bob Challenge, the Bug Out Bag Challenge. It began in post-2008 financial collapse era, when social media was beginning to thrive. And so many folks began testing skills and equipment. Right? You think you have everything in your bug out bag. Well, one way to test it is to go on an adventure. Here in Canada, you drive to the nearest crown land, you walk into the bush for about 1 kilometer from where you park your car, and hang out for 36 hours, right? That's long enough to see if there's sufficient equipment and support or things that things work the way you think they should. So the idea is that if you think you have a bug out bag capable of supporting you and your family for 72 hours and you're an adventurous group of people, then you take a weekend and you go on a trip, right? You grab your bug out bag, that's it, your normal clothes that you would have on any run of a work day, and you go for a drive, you park your car, you walk a kilometer or so, 0.6 of a mile into the woods, to far enough away from your car, and you're not putting yourself in any incredible danger, and then you just find a spot in the woods, a random spot, you set it up, and you live there for a weekend. And that's the Bob Challenge. And it's actually got pretty big. There were some individual TV shows for a period of time where they had bug out bag challenges or things along that lines. There are people demonstrating it on YouTube videos. The idea being, though, if you have bug out bags, if you have go bags or things like that, and then that's something you feel that's necessary in your preparedness planning, that I'm not going to argue with you. I belittle the concept from the beginning because a lot of times what the public sector resident facing preparedness communication talks about setting up an emergency kit, right? My argument with setting up the emergency kit has always been that it becomes too much of a default insurance plan, right? People think that they're ready for an emergency because they've assembled goods that have already existed in your house. You've put them all in one place. Great. Fantastic. You can find your flashlight, right? I'm an evidence guy. I'm a researcher. I've spent over a decade looking at preparedness evidence, and there is not one single evidentiary piece of data that supports the idea that individuals possessing a bug out bag, a go bag, or an emergency kit had a better post-event outcome than the people who did not. The data doesn't exist. Now, arguably, you could say it'll just make life easier. Well, probably it will. But the problem when you prescribe it as part of a preparedness plan is people believe that if I do that, I've now achieved preparedness, right? It may give a significant false sense of security to somebody because they haven't thought through the plans. They haven't thought through the idea. I've always said that there are times when you go through the full program of setting up a family preparedness plan, and we've got a free download over at preparednesslabs.ca, a free 3-page download that's there for you as a starter of how to think about building a family preparedness plan. We've also got it in a book form and a course form. The links are all on the website there for you. But the idea is when you go through the formal process of this and build the plan, you might actually find that there's a capability you'd like to be able to execute in a certain situation, and you lack the physical good to make that possible, right? So I'm not saying that you may not have to purchase something. My argument has always been that you want to purchase something as a result of a hole in a plan that you've identified and a plan you've created for your family, right? So that acquisition is targeted, it's necessary, and it's for a purpose. Not just a PDF downloadable link of things that are thrown together in a bag, put in the trunk of your car, and look at me, I'm safe and good to go. That, for me, has always been a recipe for danger. Because without a plan and simply a kit, you may actually think that you're prepared for a situation, and you're more than likely not any further down the spectrum than you were before. So that Bob challenge is pretty neat. And if you're part of a group with a location, a bug out location, try a weekend to gather and have an in situ TTX for the group. Now, how this will work, you check comms, equipment, food, everything. Now, if you are interested in adopting a prepared life and you go through all the steps necessary to do that, and then you find like-minded individuals and you decide that you would like to gather as a group in a significant event and support each other, even at a secondary location, if that's a world that you go down, then a TTX for you is just as important, because you need to gather as a group to figure out who's going to do what, who's responsible for what. But the most important part of any group dynamics, and Dr. Kaner put this really well in his book on facilitation, it's had several editions and it's probably the best out there, is how do you make decisions, right? And Dr. Sam Kaner called it going through the divergent zone, the grown zone, and the convergent zone. And the idea being is you have to figure out a methodology that everybody agrees to as to how you're going to work through a decision. Now, consensus decisions are always the best in a group, but it's really hard to get absolutely everybody 100% behind. So again, Dr. Sam Kaner came up with something called the gradients of agreement, and it's a 5-level process. One end it says I don't agree at all, and the other end it says I completely agree. And then there's gradients of agreement, and they say things like I have some problems with it, but I can get behind it fully. Or the middle one, I have significant problems, but this is likely the best solution we'll come up with. Or while there are merits to the program, I have sufficient disagreement with the program that I currently cannot support it. And those are different gradients of agreement that you may come up with, and certain levels will be acceptable. But really, a resource like Dr. Kaner's book is fantastic. The idea behind it in a group settings is the most important thing that groups need to come together is how are we going to make decisions? And you need to understand that methodology and agree to it prior to the commencement. And I'll give you an example. I teach graduate level education at university in emergency management, right? So these students are all professionals, that some of them have 20-year careers in the fire, police, EMS, whatever it may be, and they're coming to get their graduate education in disaster and emergency management. The first thing that we get them to do when they put on teams, because most of graduate work is teams. So I'll take my 21 students and I'll put them on 3 teams of 7. They have to sign a team agreement. That's the first thing they do in their first team meeting. How are we going to get along? How are we going to make decisions? How are people going to opt out? Are we a 4-3 is perfect? Or are we a 5-2 group? What is the level where a decision has to be taken? And everybody accepts that, and they all sign a team agreement in week 1 of their graduate education. Before we really even launch in the detailed material, the teams agree, because that's the most important thing. So as they get down and they're doing project analyses and they're solving case study problems and they're developing group presentations, when you have 7 different people, and a lot of these people are type A personalities, they have to have previously agreed how to make a decision, because in the heat of the moment, when deadlines are approaching, people get amped up, attitudes come out, and people can revert to, no, we agreed that this is how we would do it, so we're all going to follow the process, right? So we do that in graduate education today when I lecture and teach in disaster and emergency management. So it falls on the same line that when you sit down with your family or sit down with your workplace. And this is just as adaptable. And this is the last point we'll talk about on today's podcast episode, is talking about the corporate business environment. Now, we've talked about your family. We've talked about how emergency services does it. We talked about it if you're going Uber top shelf level with your preparedness, you're going to start a prepper group. But when you're looking at your workplace, right? Health and safety has a lot of regulations in workplaces. If you are a workplace that has a business continuity plan or a business preparedness plan, you're going to want to advocate for a TTX at the business, to take some time, carve some time out of the busy workday to sit down with you and your colleagues, run by your version of emergency management staff, whatever lives in your corporate environment, so that you understand how the corporation expects to roll it out, so that you understand what are the expectations on you by your corporation, your employer, when an emergency hits. Because a great friend of mine who owns the #1 podcast in emergency preparedness in Canada reminded me of the concept of role abandonment. And that's when people walk away from their jobs because there's a higher priority. Now, I'm not really happy with that, but it is a term used in science, so I'm not going to argue with the presence or the value of the term. The point that I'm arguing is, if a significant emergency happens in your town and your family may be affected and you're at work, the statistics and data tell us that you're more than likely to get up and walk away from your work to go check on your family. Once your family is safe and secure and good to go to the best extent possible, you are then willing to return to your work to resume normal operations if you're needed. The point is that your business may be assuming in their business continuity plan that irrespective of the effect in the local area, you will remain in your job. So that is a big issue. So if there is a tornado that goes through a part of town where you live and your business operations are affected and your business has you filling a key spot in the emergency plan, and you put your hand up and you're like, I'm leaving, right? That's my family area. I'm going to go check on my family. The cell network are down. And the boss says, no, you're in charge of these response operations. You have to stay here at work. Don't put yourself in that difficult position. This is where TTXs are valuable in advance, because you have that conversation in the workplace. Those TTXs in the workplace likely are not going to occur unless somebody becomes an advocate for them. I'm suggesting today that you adopt that advocacy. So today's episode was all about preparedness, exercises, and adventure. I hope it was of value to you. Please take the time to drop me a line at jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. The links are all over at our website at www.insidemycanoehead.ca to provide us feedback, to tell us how we're doing, to tell us ideas that you would like to see in upcoming episodes of this podcast. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And if you do nothing else, I simply ask that you do one thing, and that is to tell somebody else about this podcast if you find it valuable, to give you ideas, to think about preparedness, to make your family in a better position the next time the shizzy hits the fizzy. Thanks again for joining us. Take care. Stay safe.